Dear students, in this video we will be discussing two types of literature reviews: systematic literature reviews and normal reviews. Specifically, we will be focusing on the problems associated with normal reviews and why systematic literature reviews are a better alternative. First, let's define what we mean by normal literature reviews. These are literature reviews that are typically found in academic papers where the process of the literature review is not documented. This means that the literature review just appears without any explanation of how it was produced. The lack of documentation makes it difficult for others to replicate the literature review process and arrive at the same results. One example of an excellent normal literature review is the refactoring paper from year 2004, which can be found from IEEE Explorer database. However, even in this paper, the process is not documented. If we look into the paper, we can see that it starts out by introducing the topic. That is typically done. However, if we look into the introduction section, we can see that there is no definition of the literature review process. The next section, section 2, is a running example that they utilize throughout the paper. However, also section 2 includes no specification of how the literature review process itself was conducted. Moving to section 3, we can see that it discusses refactoring activities. If we move to section 4, we can see it discusses refactoring techniques and formalisms. Moving on to section 5, we can see it discusses types of software artifacts that can be refactored. Section 6 brings out the different types of tool support that is available for software refactoring. In section 7, they discuss the process support available for software refactoring. And finally, section 8 offers the conclusion. Although the paper references an impressive number of 111 papers, we have no idea how the 111 references were found, which makes it impossible to reproduce this literature review process. We have to keep in mind that this paper was published in 2004, and under the current scientific standards in software engineering, it would not be possible to publish such paper right now, as the literature reviews are currently done with systematic approach. All science should be replicable and transparent. This means that someone else should be able to repeat the literature review process and end up with the same results. Now, let's have a look how systematic literature reviews solve this problem. Here is an example of a systematic literature review paper that studies the review on the topic of time pressure in software engineering. In systematic literature review papers, you will always find this type of process figure that explains the steps, activities, and databases taken while conducting the systematic literature review. If we start from the top left corner, we can see that we have two databases, Scopus and Google Scholar. The initial searches from these databases outputted 2,100 papers. For these 2,100 papers, an inclusion and exclusion criteria was applied. After applying the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the authors were left with 50 papers. However, there was also a parallel track for which 11 papers were selected as seed papers, and then what followed was so-called snowballing. Snowballing is an activity where you follow the forward and backward references of a particular paper to find more relevant papers of the topic. What happens in backward snowballing is that you take a particular paper, let's say we take this paper for example, and we want to perform backward snowballing on this paper. This means that we go to the reference list of this paper, which is presented at the end of the paper, and we study the reference list here. So we go backwards in time to find more relevant references of a particular topic. Forward snowballing is just the reverse, and for that you need to utilize some type of tool, for example like a Google Scholar or Scopus. And if we use this time pressure paper again as an example and we want to do forward snowballing, then we go to, for example, the Google Scholar and we find the paper there, and then we look, oh, it's been cited by 41 papers, so these 41 papers now become the papers that we investigate in forward snowballing. So we move forwards in time. And by clicking this link here, we get the 41 papers that are citing this paper, and then we can study again this reference list to find more relevant search results. Okay, so the snowballing resulted in 3,314 papers, and for those we applied the same inclusion and exclusion criteria as for the initial search. After that, a final set of papers is gathered, 16 from Scopus, 45 from Google Scholar, 33 from snowballing, and we notice that we still, despite of using the systematic approach, we find 5 papers through ad hoc searches that were not part of the systematic search approach. So even a small fraction of those sort of non-systematic search results are still here. Okay, so we got 102 papers, and after that those are processed with appropriate data coding methods, which depends on the type of systematic review you are doing. In this case it was mostly qualitative coding, but it could also be quantitative meta-analysis type of approach, depending on the type of data that is available in the papers you happen to find during the searches. But now, let's step backwards a bit and see how this systematic approach solves some of the problems that we had in traditional reviews. So, systematic search starts with the definition of keywords. There, multiple searches should be used to establish keywords and their possible synonyms. Use of synonym engines and asking advice from other scientists is also recommended in order to find all the synonyms for the search terms you are looking for. For example, for the time pressure paper, we found synonyms such as schedule pressure, time budget pressure, deadline pressure. Then you can also formulate this as pressure of time, pressure of schedule, or pressure of time budget, or pressure of deadline. And finally, there is also a concept of speed accuracy trade-off that can be also used to refer as a situation where time pressure is present. So after determining the appropriate keywords, only after that we did the initial searches and extracted the 2,100 results from Scopus and Google Scholar. So, as we used appropriate keywords, we were confident that we have a good number of relevant papers, but for all of those papers we still needed to apply the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Systematic review has explicit inclusion and exclusion criteria, unlike the normal literature reviews. Determining this criteria requires good knowledge of the topic and also trial searches and reading of the existing papers. Still, even though we had a good knowledge of the topic, it is possible that the inclusion and exclusion criteria evolves during the systematic literature review process. There can always be studies that were not anticipated to be found, and if such studies are discovered, this can lead to changes in how the criteria is interpreted, new rules in the criteria, or a definition of the existing inclusion and exclusion criteria. in this example paper, we had 2 inclusion criteria. So the main focus is time pressure in software engineering context, was the first one. The second one was that the paper presents empirical evidence of time pressure in software engineering. So we did find papers whose main focus was not time pressure in software engineering, but they still presented empirical evidence of the time pressure in software engineering. So they had some data where time pressure was perhaps an explaining variable in the model. So we also decided to include these types of papers, although their main focus was not the time pressure, but still they provided empirical evidence for the study. We excluded papers that were not written in English, papers that didn't come from a scientific source, or if the task studied was not the software development task. To summarize, the problems with normal literature reviews include lack of transparency and replicability, as there is no documentation of the search process. This may also lead to lack of systematic searches and selection strategy. Also, other possible problems are vague research questions, poor data analysis, and reporting. On the other hand, systematic literature reviews have a documented process, documented keywords, an explicit inclusion and exclusion criteria, and higher potential for replicability and transparency. Additionally, systematic literature review may include activities like snowballing and study quality assessments. In study quality assessment, the quality of the original studies are assessed in order to prevent low quality studies from entering the evidence that the systematic literature review is summarizing. Okay, thank you for watching, and until the next video.